Hi, this is the third of these wee videos on faith and politics. I ended the last one, which was one that was kind of thinking about ideas around truth, with the question, who is my neighbor? So that's the question coming back to today. And it's a hugely important question at the moment when we think about um, who we are kind of living with, who's around us, and we think about the convulsions that are going on of distrust, of hatred, of language that is um, deeply, well, there's racist language is on the rise. There are acts of violence on the rise. Number of hate crimes that are recorded over the last year or so has been on the rise. There's been talk of closing borders, of barricading kind of entrance ways, of enforcing and toughening up immigration rules into countries, and we've seen some of that already playing itself out over the last few weeks. And of course, it's not just over the last few weeks. This is something that's been a rising issue for quite a while now. So this question, who is my neighbor? Who is the other, in the sense, not part of my tribe, not part of my family? How do we deal with our neighbor? Now, before kind of going into the politics of it, I'm going to start with the other way around today. One of the rules of thumb within kind of the church, anyway, when thinking about a difficult question like this one, is to ask whether anything similar ever happened that is mentioned in the Bible that we can kind of look at. And it's perfect for this question, who is my neighbor? Because there is an actual story in the Bible where that very question is asked. And it is an absolute favorite story of many, so much so that you don't just get it in the big kind of, let me have a look, this kind of that kind of Bible, but you also get it in this kind of Bible. My type, much easier, pictures and everything. So where does this story come from? Well, it comes from Jesus talking with various different people going around, and he's talking one day to somebody who asks, because folks were always asking questions, wanting to find out from Jesus what he thought about this issue, that issue, and all these kind of things, which is great because we have a lot of kind of his kind of thoughts and stories. Now, of course, he didn't give political answers usually. He usually answered by way of a story, which kind of raises more questions in itself. But the whole point of the story is to challenge you and to get you to think about what your kind of priorities are, what are the most important things. And so one day, this guy asked Jesus, how can I please God and be his friend forever? And then this is kind of where it links back to the last one of these videos, because Jesus' response is, keep God's rules, live the way God wants you to. And then he adds, love God first, then love your neighbor as you love yourself. So that's that kind of idea of the golden rule, which, as I said last time, is not just a Christian thing. Many faiths have this golden rule as a part of their ethic. So then the man asks the question, trying to trick Jesus, but who is my neighbor? Being the kind of canny person this guy obviously was. And so then Jesus goes in and tells a story. And it's the story of the Good Samaritan. So it's a really well-known story. There's a guy walking along the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and it's a dusty, it's a dirty old road, this one, and it kind of goes right in between, and you can kind of follow where this road would be even today, kind of through mountains and hills. And so there are all kinds of places where along the road robbers could hide out. And so that's what happens in this man in Jesus' story. He gets attacked by a bunch of robbers and left for dead on the road. Well, then a holy man comes along and sees this guy lying on the side of the road. And you assume, as Jesus is telling the story, that the holy man is going to help. But when he spots the injured man, he doesn't want to get his hands dirty because there's the whole purity rules of the time, and there'll be blood and flies and all kinds of things around this poor guy. So the holy man walks on. Then another guy comes along who is another holy man, and he pretends not even to see what has been going on, looks across to the other side of the road and carries on. Now finally, the third man comes along in Jesus' story, and this man is from Samaria. He's a Samaritan. So you've got to remember that this story is being told to a group of Jewish folks, Jesus being a Jew. So they would assume that the person who was injured on the road was one of them, was a Jew. And this is a foreigner, somebody from another nation, another place, another area, distrusted area, comes along. So if you're thinking kind of pantomime telling of the story, that's probably when the kind of booing and hissing would start, when you mention this person from Samaria coming along. So you assume he's not going to do anything, but this Samaritan stops, even though he was supposed to be the enemy of the wounded guy, and helps him out, binds his wounds up, takes him to an innkeeper, pays some money to make sure the innkeeper will look after the guy, and the wounded guy. Here's second page. Look at this fantastic story here. So here he's coming to the innkeeper here, and making sure that he is okay. So then Jesus, having told the story, and everyone kind of like thinking, the story's not quite worked out the way I thought the story was going to work out, asks the question, who do you think acted to be like a good neighbor to the man who was attacked by robbers? And of course, the man who was kind of trying to trick Jesus out has to admit it's the one who helped him. And then Jesus says, well, that's the way that God wants you to live your life. Okay, so it's a typical parable of Jesus. There are kind of different layers of meaning in it, depending on kind of who you are that's listening, whether you're just listening to a story about somebody helping out and it's just good to help people out, or whether the underlying politics of it is understood to you. So when we tend to hear this story ourselves, we tend to hear it on that kind of surface level of the person who helps out is being a good neighbor, right? So it's just if you're a good neighbor, you help other people out, and that's a good thing. But there is another layer to this story, and it revolves around the different nationalities of the people involved. And here you need to put so when we tend to tell the story, we tend to tell it like you're putting yourself in the position of somebody walking by this person, whether you're the holy people that walk by and look the other way, oh, I don't want to look that way, don't want to see what's going on, or whether you would actually get your hands dirty, kneel down and help somebody who's hurt. And there are loads of videos that you can see on YouTube of this kind of good Samaritan phenomenon of people who pass by. You know, somebody will have fallen over, will have collapsed in the London Underground or something like that, and hundreds of people just walk by. They don't even notice that somebody has collapsed there. So that's where that part of that kind of reading of the story comes from. But there's another reading of the story which forces you to put yourself in the position of actually the people that would have first heard the story would have been in. And they would have been Jesus folk, Jewish folk, listening to this story. So they would have put themselves in the position of the injured person, so the person that was hurt. And there, it's not the folks that they would expect who came to their rescue. It wasn't their fellow brothers and sisters, the people in their own tribe who came and helped them. It wasn't those who kind of had authority, had positions where they were supposed to be the good people of the day who came and helped. it ended up actually being an outsider. It ended up being a Samaritan, somebody who was a different nationality, a foreigner. That is the person that helped. And so the story is more about what is your attitude towards the neighbor. How do you see them? So it's not just about will you offer help to somebody else who is your neighbor, but will you receive help and assistance from your neighbor from another nationality or wherever it might be. So the kind of them and us rules are being broken down in this story. Okay, so who is my neighbor? So there's a great story there about these rules kind of being broken down. Now there is a fantastic book. There's a guy who's an economist, I think he is, Paul Collier. I'll put a link in the once I've finished the video into the description for this. He's written at least 3 kind of popular books that are kind of okay for me, who is not a fully fledged economist or whatever, to read. Now, one of them is all about immigration. It's called Exodus. The subtitle is Immigration and Multiculturalism in the 21st Century. Now, Paul Collier has also written a couple of other books, The Plundered Planet, which is about climate change and how we use resources in our planet, and how to do this in a way that is not going to destroy the planet. And then probably his most famous book is a book called The Bottom Billion, which is looking at the kind of bottom billion population-wise in the world, the poorest, and how they've got kind of trapped in that place and what can be done to try and help those there, predominantly folks in kind of sub-Saharan Africa. So 3 really good books, lots of information. I highly recommend them. And I read maybe the one about immigration a year or 2 ago, something like that. So I'm kind of going back on my memory of what I was reading there. But I really appreciate the book because it delves into some of the complexities of immigration when we think about immigration on a kind of nationwide kind of level. And that is what we're talking about when we're talking about today in politics. Who is my neighbor? Is how are we dealing with folks who are coming from different countries, different places, and the complexities of folks making kind of choices about different identities that they are going to take on. And I appreciate about this book because it really kind of lays us out quite clearly the challenges that there are. There are no easy answers, but it helps lay out the challenges and the relative kind of importance of these. So one of the things that was quite interesting from that is the idea that other immigrants into a country would want to help their fellow immigrants come into the country, which is not entirely correct, because the kind of rational choice of immigrants would be, as soon as you're in, you pull up the ladder and don't let anyone else in, because then you will have the kind of maximum benefit from the society in which you have emigrated. Which is pretty cold and callous when you think about it, but it is a kind of economically, it is a rational place to be. But there are for folks that are emigrating, they're coming to another country and then becoming immigrants in a new country. There are big choices to make. And they're really choices about how much of your own home identity you keep. Do you kind of try to maintain a difference from the people that you move in with, or embrace a whole new identity? And those are not straightforward, because there's obviously a kind of desire to hang on to parts of the culture that you grew up in, because that is home. And you certainly see that in the Bible, and kind of following the stories of some of the kind of tribes as they're moving around, this idea, and really the whole Jewish people of being being a kind of light to other nations, being a little bit different, even when you find yourself in exile somewhere, which happened on some occasions when their land was invaded. Of trying to keep sense of who you are as a people, while also integrating yourself within the new community that you are. So getting that kind of balance right is not straightforward. It's not easy, either for the countries that are trying to help people or for the people themselves in trying to hang on to their thoughts there. But I mean, it's important to think about some of the challenges that are being faced by folks, and especially when we've got so much language around us at the moment that kind of frames everything in the most bipolar kind of way, with race, really fierce racism and bigotry and xenophobia, hostility on the one side, and then folks kind of arguing for completely open doors on the other side. Of course, inevitably, what you need to work out, and this is the nasty and messy business of politics, is kind of something in between, something that kind of tries to satisfy the range of different views that there are in any culture, and try to work towards some kind of way between, which is never easy, and especially when the popularist rhetoric has started to dominate what is being said within a political sphere. So that is really, really challenging for us at the moment. Now, of course, that populist rhetoric isn't coming out of nowhere. It is coming as a result of trade, economic policies that have come from our own kind of neoliberal movement, and that has been great for some, but not so great for many others, and particularly those who are in the working class or kind of lower middle class. It's really fed into a much greater inequality, which then feeds into a sense of despair and a sense of things are not right in the world. Not being sure about what you can do to make those things right, but things aren't right, and so it's easy to try and find some person to either blame, or some institution to blame, or politicians to blame, whatever it might be, which does tend to lead to a kind of simplification of what is really going on. Now, a global inequality we think about inequality like in the UK that's going on, which may have parts to play in a kind of rise in popularist rhetoric that can be quite racist and anti the other. There is also global inequality that is even greater than what we would see here in the UK, and that inevitably and it doesn't have to be just economic. Of course, we have seen over the last kind of 6 years or so, with the violence taking place in the Middle East and places like Syria, that also the desperate desire of people to flee from war-torn areas can lead to a huge amount of migration of people trying to find a place where they see greater hope and aspiration. And who are we to say that that folks cannot hold on to that idea of hope and aspiration in a different place? Now, what our response to it is a whole nother matter, but you can totally understand why people have that feeling. So it's interesting. Paul Collier in his book Exodus talks about this mass migration that we're seeing at the moment of people. And of course, he is mostly talking about a kind of economic migration, whereas in the last few years we've seen huge migration because of, as I say, what's going on in the Middle East. But he talks about it as just a temporary phase, in the sense of we're in this transition of huge upheavals in communication, in information, in how we do trade at the moment. And as the kind of economic gain, and again, it's like the difference between a positive sum or a zero sum kind of situation, as that starts to creep up for all countries, that kind of migration will will ease out. It won't take place as much as is happening at the moment. But some countries are growing slower than others at the moment, so it causes these huge growing pains to be going on. And he says, come back in 100 years or whatever, it may look very different. But he was also writing that, I think, prior to the ascent of the far right in the US and Europe, and this real rise of strong nationalism that we've seen in the last couple of years, really a lot. So some aspects of immigration are good. I mean, they are really good. You more racially diverse communities, and that's fantastic. Communities really can grow from that. And here in Aberdeen, we see that in a big way. The primary schools are filled with different nationalities, and that's great. And that's a real then cross flow of understanding and learning. But there are pros and cons. It's never easy to get this one right. So just a couple of things to kind of think about. If migration happens too quickly, if it runs ahead of the capacity of a community to be able to assimilate people within a new culture, then you risk, of course, the challenge of communities developing that don't assimilate at all. And then the danger there is that some of the most kind of dysfunctional parts of the cultures from which the folks emigrated are the very parts that are hung on to. It's a weird thing that, but I've experienced that in kind of expat communities. So thinking about either Scots moving to London, and the church I grew up in there was a Church of Scotland in the middle of London, and you always had that kind of idea that that church was like what the Church of Scotland is up in Scotland 30 years ago, because it's what people remembered from where they'd come from, that they kind of wanted to hold on to because it's part of their identity. And you get the same kind of thing if you go sometimes to parts of Spain, kind of that expat community of folks kind of hanging on to their view of what England or Scotland or whatever was like when they left, 20 years ago or whatever. So you get that idea of hanging on to things that may not be good. And exactly the same thing happens with folks emigrating from their own country into a new one and hanging on to some things that maybe are not the best things to hang on to. The other danger, a big danger, is for countries that have kind of net migration out from them, is that it would tend to be those who have the opportunity to be able to leave that do, and they may well be the ones that are more educated, that have greater skills, that know they'll be able to find opportunity elsewhere. And so you get this kind of brain drain away from a country, a nation that is slower to pick up, and that leaves real challenges. And I was in Malawi a couple of years ago, and you could see there the country trying to fight exactly that from happening, of people getting an education, maybe coming to the UK or going to the United States for further education, and then staying and not coming back and bringing those skills back to their own country. So these are complicated questions relating to immigration, and that kind of question of how do we treat our neighbor when we're thinking about our neighbor, not just as our neighbor who lives next door, but our neighbor in neighboring nations where there is a flow of people backwards and forwards. So I guess to come back to the story that Jesus gave, that story for me, that who is, to answering that question, who is my neighbor, the story gives a kind of ground, a kind of base assumption from which to work from, and then everything else you kind of build from there. And that's kind of, for me, of course, the interplay of faith and politics. So the story gives that general assumption of a positive attitude towards our neighbor, and trying to break down the kind of them and us barriers that are otherwise so easy to build up, and then kind of work from that assumption to, okay, what do we do, rather than working from an assumption of the other must be bad, the other must be wrong, and how do we try and limit, or whatever it is we're doing with that kind of assumption. So it gives you a different point of view from which to approach the same issue, if that kind of makes sense. I this week, earlier this week, actually spent some time with a refugee from Syria, from Aleppo in Syria, and we went into local school and talked to a couple of the classes in the school about what life is like as a refugee, what it is the country was like in Syria, why folks have been leaving Syria, and what folks are looking for, and in looking for peace and looking for stability and looking for hope for them and for their families, but the challenges that there have been in that process. Some 4.5 million people, I think, something like that, the numbers at the moment, having left Syria as a result of the violence, the war that's going on within Syria at the moment. Now, that was a really good thing to do, because it's about gaining knowledge, gaining understanding of some of the complexities of what's happening and how those complexities impact individual lives and impact individual families. And it's often at that level that we can kind of understand and grasp and see a way to be able to help people. And when we just think about kind of level at nation level, it becomes so cold and callous. It's really hard to kind of get to the what's really going on and the impact this has on people's lives. So that spirit of empathy, spirit of compassion, while also acknowledging the very difficult choices that we make when we're thinking about immigration, that political leaders, the kind of choices that we put into their hands. Now, these are not simple choices, so we need to be open to recognizing that it's not simple. But that kind of spirit of empathy and compassion towards our neighbor, how we treat our neighbor, should always be rattling around in our minds. And that's kind of where, that's partly Jesus' response to that question, was to make sure that was always in people's minds and thinking about these things. So there is no way to do justice to an issue as big as immigration in a short video like this one, but there's a wee story that maybe gives some kind of reflection on how we then think about the complexities of those issues and talk about them with each other, and talk about them with other people, particularly people that try to polarize things into really clear-cut good, bad, as we've seen at the moment. This the horrendous mixture of terrorism and refugee and immigrant, how they've all got intertwined together in the rhetoric of some on the right, is just horrendously damaging to the whole enterprise of trying to talk through decent ways of dealing with the really difficult challenges, because, as we know, the vast majority of those who are refugees from Syria at the moment are folks just looking for peace from horrendous situations that they have come from. Anyway, something else to think about in this series here, and I'll try and get another one up later on in the week. Thanks for joining me. Talk to you later. Bye.